One of the reasons why Adobe Illustrator is such a wonderful tool to use for creating infographics is because it has a feature built into it called graphs. It basically allows you to bring in data from a program like Excel, for example, and turn that data into graphics, be it as a pie chart or a line chart or a column chart, so on and so forth. At the same time, it's important to realize that the graph tools that are present inside of Illustrator haven't been updated in quite some time. So while certain things have been modernized and improved upon in Illustrator over the years, that may not be the case with graphs. For example, you may take it for granted that when applying a drop shadow, you can check a little preview button so that as you modify the settings for that drop shadow, you see a preview of that on your screen. However, the graph tools don't have a preview option. So basically you have to dial in some settings, click OK, see how it looks, and if you don't like it, you have to go back into those dialog boxes and make some changes. However, just because the tools haven't been updated in a while, it doesn't mean that they aren't powerful. In fact, I think you'll find that the graphing functions inside of Illustrator will do anything that you ask of it. And in fact, that's what we're going to explore in the coming chapters. For now, however, I want to give you a basic overview of what you can expect out of the graph tools inside of Illustrator. So I'm going to start by creating a new document here, Command-N or Control-N. For a profile here, I'm just going to choose print. Maybe I'll choose inches. And for the orientation, I'll choose a wide format and I'll click OK. Now, if I look at my tools panel, I'll see that I have many tools, including this one here called the column graph tool. If I click and hold my mouse button down on it, I'll actually see that Illustrator has many different graph tools. It's important to realize, though, that no matter which graph tool I use, I can always switch between them later on. So I never really bother with trying to select a specific tool. I'll always create my chart using the column graph tool. It's just easier to do that. And I can always change the type of chart later on. Now the tool works almost like any other drawing tool inside of Illustrator. I can position my cursor on the page and click once with the mouse, and that brings up a dialog box asking what size I want that graph to be. So I could type in a value for width and a height. Now, in the next movie, we're going to discuss more in detail exactly what width and height mean in reference to a graph. But for now, I actually want to draw one visually. So I'm going to click on the Cancel button, and I'm simply going to click and drag to define a bounding area. And when I release the mouse, I'll see a few things that now happen. First of all, Illustrator creates something called a graph object. You can see over here in the upper left-hand corner that the object that I currently have selected is called a graph. A graph, as we're going to find out, is really just a special kind of a group inside of Illustrator. It's a bunch of objects that are driven by math. That math, or those numbers, appear in this window here called the graph data window. This graph data window will appear whenever your graph is active and you want to modify that information inside of it. Now, you can see that it's made up of a series of different cells, which is very similar to the cells that you might find in a spreadsheet program. So, for example, Microsoft Excel or Apple Numbers. I can type in numbers directly here through my keyboard, or I could also import some data as well. Now again, we'll go into more detail about how to format data correctly inside of Illustrator. But for now, I'm going to get started by actually importing some data that I've already created. So I'm going to come over here to this series of icons that appear here. I'm going to click on the first one, which is Import Data. I'm going to navigate in my exercise files to Chapter 2, and I'm going to click on this file. It's a text-based file called U.S. Energy Production 2011. I'm going to choose Open, and that data is now going to come here into this window. Now, while I've imported the data, I haven't applied this data to the graph that I've created. Whenever I make changes to anything in this window, I need to click on this little checkbox over here, or the Apply button, to now tell Illustrator, take those values and now turn them into a chart. So now you can see what's happened. Let me position the window down here just a little bit. Illustrator has taken the values and the data that I've now imported, and it has converted them to a graphical form, in this case, a column chart. Now I can close this data window right now, and as I mentioned before, I have the ability to view this data using a different type of chart. To do that, I would take my selection tool to select the actual graph itself, which remember is just one big group. If I look at my layers panel, I can see that right now I have one object in my document. And I can go to the object menu, scroll down to the bottom here where it says graph, and then choose type, because I want to change the different types of ways that I can view this data. Maybe, for example, I would like to see this data graphed as a pie chart. I can choose the pie chart option right here, click OK, and Illustrator now reformats that graphic to now show me the same data, but now as a pie chart. As long as I don't ungroup this information, I can continue changing both the data and also the way that I visualize that data. So for example, I'm going to go back to the Object menu, choose Graph, and then choose Type, change this back to a column chart, click OK. And if I wanted to change the actual numbers, I can go choose Object, scroll down to where it says Graph, reopen the data window, and now change the values. For example, maybe I want renewable to change to 17. Again, I'll hit the Tab key to accept that value in this cell, and then I'll click on the checkbox, and now you'll see that that value has updated in the chart. I'll go ahead and I'll close this window, and just to show you what would happen if I were to ungroup this, I can go to the Object menu now and choose Ungroup, and Illustrator will give me a warning. It will tell me, right now I have a graph selected, but if I were to ungroup this, I will no longer be able to modify the data inside this graph. In fact, it'll just be a series of objects and will no longer be this special type of object, which is a graph. So I'm going to click on the Yes button over here, and now you can see that it's been reduced to a regular group. It's no longer a graph object. And if I look over here in my Layers panel, I now see that I have several groups here that I can work with. If I deselect it and I click on this, I can see that there are different groups that are now present inside of my document. It's as if I had taken regular rectangles and drawn them to these specific sizes or dimensions. And by the way, that's really the most important thing to note here. I don't have to worry about trying to conform Illustrator's somewhat ancient graph feature to create the final graphics that I want. However, it's a great way for me to get started by creating graphics in a proportional form so that I can now start to work with them on my own. And as we'll see throughout the rest of this course, there are some times when I want to actually ungroup my graph and kind of modify the shapes of my own. And there are also some times where I want to be able to preserve this information as live data so that as time goes on, I can continuously modify that data and have Illustrator update the graph accordingly. So now that we understand how graphs work inside of Illustrator, let's take a closer look at exactly what each of the parts inside of a graph actually are. We'll do that in the next movie.